The Galactic Council Hall, an architectural marvel of the galaxy, stretched out like a shimmering jewel against the black canvas of space. The enormous station orbited a distant blue star, its reflective surface catching rays of light and casting them into the void like a beacon. Inside, the main hall was a breathtaking sight, a vast, tiered chamber that could hold representatives from hundreds of species. The walls were lined with banners and holographic displays, each one depicting the unique symbols of the civilizations in attendance. The air buzzed with the sounds of dozens of languages being translated in real time by a chorus of advanced AI systems, creating a symphony of voices both mechanical and organic. Today, the hall was filled to capacity. Representatives from every corner of the galaxy had gathered, their faces etched with worry and frustration. This was no ordinary session. An urgent crisis had forced the council to convene. At the center of the debate were three powerful species: the Xendar, the Quillash, and the Viridians. The subject of their dispute was a lucrative asteroid belt, one that spanned a region of space filled with rare minerals essential for advanced technologies. It was a treasure trove, and all three species were determined to claim it as their own. Negotiations had dragged on for months, with no end in sight. The Xendar, massive reptilian creatures with obsidian scales, argued that the belt was part of their ancient hunting grounds, passed down through generations. The Quillash, elegant serpentine beings that glowed with a soft bioluminescent light, countered with historical documents, claiming they had been mining the area for centuries. The Viridians, with their tall, silver-skinned forms, presented data suggesting that their technological advancements had made the belt more accessible and, therefore, their rightful claim. Each argument was met with louder and more heated rebuttals, and the air grew thick with the tension of unresolved conflict. Amid the rising clamor, a new figure quietly stepped into the chamber's center. Richard Kane, the human diplomat, stood out starkly against the sea of alien forms. He was middle-aged, with a composed expression and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. This was his first major appearance at the council, and he knew he had a lot to prove. Despite humanity's recent arrival on the interstellar scene, he had built a reputation for being a clever negotiator, though most in the room were skeptical. Humans, after all, were seen as inexperienced newcomers, untested in the complex web of galactic politics. Low murmurs filled the chamber as he approached the central platform. Many of the alien diplomats leaned closer to their neighbors, whispering in disbelief. "A human? Here to solve this mess?" One Xendar scoffed, his voice a deep rumble that carried across the room. The Quillash representative coiled her long, sinuous body, her luminous eyes narrowing with skepticism. The Viridian ambassador raised a silver eyebrow, more intrigued than dismissive, but still doubtful. Richard, however, paid no attention to the whispered doubts. He had faced this kind of skepticism before. With a calm smile, he stepped up onto the platform, giving a respectful nod to the assembly. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he listened. He listened as the Xendar representative pounded his clawed fist against the table, declaring their ancient rights. He listened as the Quillash diplomat hissed, producing shimmering holographic records to back her claims. He listened as the Viridian ambassador presented data projections, his voice laced with a cool, detached logic. The voices overlapped, accusations flying back and forth, but Richard stood there in silence, observing everything with a thoughtful expression. He seemed unperturbed by the chaos, as if he were piecing together a puzzle that only he could see. The room grew louder, filled with the cacophony of competing arguments and thinly veiled threats. Yet Richard did not flinch. He folded his hands behind his back and waited, his eyes darting between the speakers, catching subtle cues. A flicker of hesitation here, a glance of uncertainty there. Finally, as the noise reached its peak, Richard raised his hand. The room fell silent almost immediately, the sudden quiet as jarring as the previous commotion. All eyes turned to him, a mix of curiosity and doubt. Here was a human, standing alone in the center of the most powerful political arena in the galaxy, facing representatives who had been locked in this dispute for longer than his species had been part of the council. And yet, There he was, smiling calmly, as if he held an answer they hadn't even thought to consider. It was a bold move, but Richard Kane knew this was his moment. The fate of the negotiations, and perhaps even the fate of an entire region of the galaxy, now rested in his hands. The debate had reached a fever pitch. At the center of the council hall, the Zendar representative, a towering figure with jet-black scales and eyes like molten lava, slammed his massive clawed fist onto the stone table. The impact reverberated through the chamber, silencing the murmurs of the surrounding delegates. "The asteroid belt belongs to us by right," he bellowed, his deep voice echoing across the room. "It has been part of our ancestral hunting grounds for millennia. We will not be denied what is ours by tradition and blood." The Quill-Ash diplomat, a lithe and sinuous being coiled on her platform, responded with a sharp, hissing retort. Her scales glimmered in shades of blue and green as they caught the light, casting an ethereal glow across the room. "Your ancient claims are irrelevant," she spat, unfurling a series of holographic documents that hovered in the air between her and the Zendar. "We have mined those asteroids for centuries. Our records are clear and indisputable. The resources we've extracted have sustained countless systems. You cannot rewrite history to suit your whims." The Viridian ambassador, tall and slender, his body shimmering like liquid mercury, stepped forward with the cold confidence of one who deals in logic and data. He projected a detailed map of the asteroid belt, filled with complex figures and resource estimates. "While you argue over ancient history," he said in a voice that was calm yet cutting, "we have been the ones extracting resources efficiently and responsibly. Our operations have increased the output by 35% in the last 5 cycles alone. To hand control over to either of you would be to sacrifice progress for petty grievances." The room erupted into chaos once again, voices overlapping as accusations flew back and forth. Richard Kane watched from his place at the edge of the central platform, his expression inscrutable. He didn't join in the shouting. Instead, he remained quiet, observing the unfolding drama with a keen eye. As he listened, he began to notice small but significant details that the others seemed to overlook. The Zendar's claim of ancient rights was loud and forceful, but Richard detected a slight hesitation in the ambassador's gaze when he mentioned their ancestral grounds, as if even he doubted the strength of his argument. The Quill-Ash diplomat, despite her aggressive stance, glanced nervously at her own holographic records, her coiling movements betraying a flicker of uncertainty. And the Viridian ambassador, while precise and methodical in his presentation, avoided eye contact with the Zendar, as if there was something left unsaid between them. Richard scribbled quick notes on his data pad, piecing together the inconsistencies like a detective unraveling a mystery. He could see it now, the cracks in their arguments, the subtle deceptions that the other representatives were too caught up in their own rhetoric to notice. When the noise reached a deafening level once more, Richard finally raised his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried weight. The hall quieted again, the alien diplomats turning their attention to him, some with open irritation, others with a growing curiosity. Richard stepped forward, his calm smile never wavering. "Esteemed representatives," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I've listened to each of your claims, and there's merit in all of them. The Zendar have a deep cultural tie to the region, one that cannot be dismissed lightly. The Quill-Ash have provided extensive records of their mining activities, showing a consistent presence for generations. And the Viridian's data on recent output improvements is both impressive and valuable." The representatives exchanged cautious glances, surprised by his acknowledgement. Perhaps they had expected him to pick a side or dismiss their arguments outright. Instead, he had shown a surprising depth of understanding, something they hadn't anticipated from a human. "However," Richard continued, his tone shifting slightly, "there are discrepancies that I believe we need to address." He turned towards the Zendar ambassador. "You mentioned ancient hunting grounds, yet your own records from a century ago show no mention of the asteroid belt being a significant part of your territory. Why is that?" The Zendar's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, his jaw clenching in silent frustration. Richard pivoted to the Quill-Ash diplomat. "And while your historical records are impressive, There's a gap in your mining logs during the period when the Viridians began their operations. Can you explain why that is? The Quillash Diplomat recoiled slightly, her scales dimming as she struggled for a response. Richard didn't wait. He turned to the Viridian ambassador next. And as for you, your recent efficiency improvements are remarkable. But why were they implemented only after the Zendar and Quillash began disputing the territory? It seems opportunistic. A murmur of shock rippled through the chamber. The three representatives were left speechless, their confident facades cracking under the pressure of Richard's pointed questions. He had exposed the flaws in their arguments with a precision they hadn't expected. "Let's set aside the claims for a moment," Richard said, his voice softer now, almost imploring. "What we're discussing here isn't just territory. It's the potential spark for a conflict that could engulf this entire sector. War over a few asteroids might seem worth it now, but the destruction it would bring, lives lost, resources wasted, would make any victory hollow." The hall fell into an uneasy silence as his words sank in. For the first time, the representatives looked beyond their own immediate desires, forced to consider the broader consequences of their actions. The debate had shifted, not through force or intimidation, but through the quiet power of a human's unexpected insight. The silence that filled the Galactic Council Hall was thick with anticipation. Every eye in the room was fixed on Richard Kane, the lone human diplomat who had dared to challenge the entrenched arguments of three powerful species. Richard took a deep breath, sensing the weight of the moment. He knew that what he was about to propose would either solidify humanity's reputation as a serious player in the galaxy or mark them as foolishly idealistic newcomers. "Esteemed representatives," Richard began, his voice calm but carrying a new intensity. "It's clear that each of you has a valid claim, and each of you possesses unique strengths. Dividing the asteroid belt will only continue the cycle of dispute, and war would lead to catastrophic losses for everyone involved. But what if, instead of fighting over this resource, you work together to share it?" A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. Richard held up a hand, continuing before the protests could begin. "I propose a joint venture between the Zendar, the Quillash, and the Viridians. A cooperative effort, overseen by the Galactic Council itself. The Zendar, with your unmatched physical strength and mining expertise, would be responsible for the extraction operations. The Quillash, with your advanced techniques in resource processing, could handle the refinement of the minerals. And the Viridians, with your superior data management systems, could oversee logistics and distribution." The room erupted. The Zendar representative barked out a laugh, a harsh, grating sound. "You suggest that we mine the resources only to hand them over to our rivals? Ridiculous. We would never trust the Quillash or Viridians with something that is rightfully ours." The Quillash diplomat hissed, her bioluminescent scales flashing in agitation. "And why should we believe the Zendar would honor any agreement? Their history is one of brute force, not cooperation." The Viridian ambassador, though less openly hostile, raised a silver eyebrow. "A bold suggestion, human but naive. Our methods are precise, efficient. We cannot afford to risk our operations on the unpredictability of others." Richard faced the barrage of skepticism with unflinching calm. He waited for the noise to die down before speaking again, his tone firm but empathetic. "I understand your concerns," he said. "But consider this. A joint venture isn't about giving up control. It's about leveraging your strengths for mutual benefit. The Zendar's mining capabilities are unmatched. The Quillash's refinement processes are the most advanced in the galaxy, and the Viridians excel at logistics and data optimization. Together, you could extract more resources, refine them more efficiently, and distribute them faster than any one of you could alone." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his next point. "On Earth, we've faced similar disputes, bitter rivals fighting over limited resources. But time and again, we found that collaboration was the path to prosperity. Former enemies became allies, not because they forgot their differences, but because they realized they were stronger together than apart. Look around you," Richard continued, sweeping his hand towards the holographic displays showing data on the disputed asteroid belt. This galaxy is vast and filled with dangers far greater than any of us here. We cannot afford to be divided when there's so much more we can achieve together." The hall fell silent. Richard's words had struck a chord, though many in the room were still processing the idea. He had invoked Earth's history, a history unknown to most of the alien delegates, but compelling in its simplicity and logic. By appealing to both their logic and their sense of survival, he had presented a vision of cooperation that was radical, yet undeniably pragmatic. The Zendar representative's laughter had died down, replaced with a thoughtful, brooding silence. He glanced at the Quill-Ash diplomat, who met his gaze with a flicker of uncertainty in her bright eyes. The Viridian ambassador, usually so controlled and analytical, seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his silver skin shimmering as if reflecting his inner turmoil. Richard stepped back, having said his piece. He didn't push the idea further. He knew better than to try to force the decision. Instead, he left the proposal hanging in the air like a challenge, daring the representatives to consider it on their own terms. He clasped his hands behind his back, allowing the silence to stretch out. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, filled with the weight of 100 unspoken thoughts. The alien delegates exchanged glances, some uncertain, some skeptical, but all clearly thinking. Richard had done the unthinkable. He had presented a solution so unexpected, so radically different from their standard approach of power struggles and territorial disputes, that it had left the entire council speechless. In that moment, Richard Kane knew he had made his mark. Whether the proposal was accepted or not, he had shown the galaxy that humanity brought something new to the table, an ability to see beyond immediate conflict, to imagine possibilities that others could not. And in a place as vast and unpredictable as the galaxy, that was a powerful gift indeed. The council hall reconvened after a brief recess, the air thick with anticipation. The mood was different now, more contemplative, less aggressive. The tension had not vanished, but there was a new undercurrent of possibility, a fragile hope that perhaps, just this once, conflict could be avoided. The delegates settled into their places, their expressions ranging from wary skepticism to cautious optimism. All eyes turned to the Zendar representative, who had been the most vocal opponent of Richard's proposal. The Zendar diplomat rose slowly, his dark scales glinting under the chamber's lights. He scanned the room, then glanced briefly at Richard, who stood calmly at the edge of the platform. "It is not in our nature," the Zendar began, his voice a low rumble, "to share what we consider our own. We are warriors, conquerors. We take what we need, and we defend it with our lives." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "But we are also not fools. This human has given us something unexpected, a solution that, while unconventional, may be the only path that spares us all from a costly conflict. For the sake of my people, I will support this joint venture." Grudgingly, a ripple of surprise passed through the room. The Quill-Ash representative, always known for her pragmatic approach, uncoiled herself and rose gracefully. Her bioluminescent scales shimmered with a pale green hue, indicating cautious agreement. "We Quill-Ash are nothing if not practical," she said, her voice a smooth, hissing whisper. "We have weighed the costs and benefits, and we see the potential of this alliance. While our trust in the Zendar and Viridians may be limited, the prospect of increased resource yields and shared advancements cannot be ignored. We are willing to proceed with this experiment." The Viridian ambassador stepped forward, his expression unreadable as always, but there was a faint shimmer to his silver skin that hinted at deep contemplation. "We Viridians value logic above all," he stated simply. "And the logical choice here is clear. Continuing this dispute would be inefficient and wasteful. Cooperation, however improbable, is the optimal solution." He turned his metallic gaze toward Richard. "Your proposal is unorthodox, human, but it has merit." With the three primary species having voiced their tentative agreement, the time had come for the council to vote. Richard watched as the delegates pressed their voting buttons, the tension in the room palpable. Each vote cast was displayed as a colored light on a central holographic screen, the balance shifting back and forth as the decision hung in the balance. Finally, the results were tallied. The motion passed by a narrow margin, but it was a victory nonetheless. The hall erupted in a wave of murmurs, shock rippling through the assembly. Representatives from countless species leaned in to confer with one another, unable to believe what they had witnessed. A human, an outsider, had succeeded where countless seasoned diplomats had failed. The stunned silence that followed was almost as loud as the debate that had preceded it. Richard allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he gathered his belongings. He knew better than to linger and bask in the attention. That was not the human way, not when the real work of implementation lay ahead. As he turned to leave, several alien diplomats approached him. The Xandar representative was first, his discomfort evident in the stiffness of his movements. He towered over Richard but offered a curt nod. "You surprised us today, human," he admitted grudgingly. "I do not trust easily, but you have earned a measure of respect. That is rare." The Quill-Ash diplomat slithered closer, her scales now glowing a soft, approving blue. "You think differently than we do, Richard Kane," she said, her voice almost admiring. "It was your creative approach that changed the course of this debate. I look forward to seeing how this alliance unfolds." Finally, the Viridian ambassador approached, his face as impassive as ever. He regarded Richard with a long, piercing stare before speaking. "You have given us much to consider," he said, his tone as neutral as the shimmering silver of his skin. "We will remember this day. The galaxy will remember it." Richard gave a respectful nod to each of them, accepting their words without gloating. He had no illusions about the road ahead. Distrust and old grievances would not vanish overnight. But he had opened a door, and that was more than anyone had managed in months of negotiations. As Richard made his way out of the council hall, whispers followed him, spreading like wildfire through the gathered representatives. The story of the human diplomat who ended a bitter dispute without threats or force would travel far and wide. It would be told in the halls of distant starships, in the marketplaces of remote colonies, and in the conference rooms of alien governments. For many, it was a tale of unexpected ingenuity and cleverness, proof that humans were not just newcomers to the galaxy. They were a species capable of seeing paths others could not. As Richard stepped into the docking bay, the door closing behind him with a soft hiss, he couldn't help but smile. Today he had done more than broker a deal. He had changed the way the galaxy saw humanity. And in a universe filled with ancient powers and complex politics, that was no small feat.